So good afternoon, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in from today. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to today's book talk for Jewish country houses. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you again for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able, you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. As I mentioned, closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Again, that's the Zoom Q&A box and not the chat. Today, we are honored to be joined by Juliet Carey and Abigail Green. Juliet Carey is Senior Curator at Waddesdon Manor, where she's in charge of paintings, sculpture, and works on paper. She has curated exhibitions and published on subjects including Elizabethan portraits and French drawings, Chardin, Gainsborough, and Gustave Moreau, Sèvres porcelain, and Edmond Duwall. This year, she has curated 2 exhibitions relating to the Jewish Country Houses project, photographs by Hélène Binet and Pablo Borenstein, The Temple of Solomon and Its Contents, which is opening July 16th, so right around the corner. Abigail Green is Professor of Modern European History at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of Brasenose College. She is author of the award-winning Moses Montefiore, Jewish Liberator Imperial Hero, which was a TLS Book of the Year and a New Republic Best Book of 2010. And she's a regular contributor to the London Review of Books and the Times Literary Supplement. Her next book, to be published by Princeton University Press, will tell the story of the Jewish revolutionaries who made European liberalism and their children who took that tradition into the 20th century and across the Atlantic. She has led the Jewish Country Houses project since its inception. You can purchase Jewish Country Houses at the link in the chat, which I highly encourage everyone to do. Thank you all again for joining us, and now I'm going to hand things over to Juliet and Abigail. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to start, of course, by saying what a pleasure it is for us to be invited to present our book to you here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And I'm sorry we're not actually in the museum, but of course it's amazing to have this very diverse group of geographies represented in the webinar. So thank you. This book was born between Waddesdon, where Juliet is senior curator, and Oxford, where I'm a professor of history. And it's been a deeply collaborative endeavour. For both of us, for different reasons, it's a project that speaks to things we were perhaps only vaguely aware of as we grew up in households that mixed Jewishness, Englishness, Europe, and art in different ways. In short, it's rather a British book. It's a project that is personal to us, but it's also the outcome of a large-scale collaborative research project based at Oxford and funded by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, the University of Oxford, and the National Trust. If you bother to count, you'll find no less than 17 authors involved in the making of this book. But to this audience, I want to give a particular shout out to Jacqueline Granick because she is American and because talking to Jacqueline as we made this book has helped us to see that both country houses and Jewish history resonate differently in the US. We call them country houses. You tend to speak of country homes. In the past, Americans even called mansions summer cottages. We talk about heritage, though you sometimes talk about public history or use heritage to mean something more intangible. And the Holocaust, very relevant in this particular room, Even in Britain, it feels quite close, but of course it was an ocean away for Americans. Not that American Jews were unaffected by this history, but they were affected in a different way. For all these reasons, we're both nervous and excited to know what you make of the stories we're about to tell. It's a book that puts Jewish history and art history into conversation, as they say. We hope to give you a taste of that through our joint presentation. It's also a book that encourages you to travel. We hope you too may visit some of these beautiful places. And even if you can't, we hope that hearing about the houses in this book from our 17 authors will enable you to travel vicariously. Over to you, Juliet.
Thank you. I have always been suspicious of the cult of the English country house, or of the country house, and I'm sure that some of you will know the series, the television series and films, Downton Abbey. And the country house is a particularly English phenomenon for most people, in most people's mind. Though it is endlessly fascinating, and many are beguiled by the comforting, nostalgic idea, in many ways a fiction, of the real country house. This, for example, is Chatsworth in Derbyshire that epitomizes that idea of the real English country house. So intimately tied to a particular locality and community that it seems to grow organically out of the landscape, about rootedness, continuity, and paternalism, about national identity and belonging. Our book challenges this idea with stories of houses owned, built, or renewed by Jews. And they tell a much more complex story of mobility, of emigration and arrival, prejudice and integration, difference and connection. Houses and families that span and connect across the whole of Europe and beyond. The book consciously plays with the tradition of the country house book. It's not a celebratory coffee table book, treasures of somewhere, the magnificence of some dynasty, but its title, Jewish Country Houses, places it firmly within that genre of lavishly illustrated books called things like the Georgian country house, if categorized by time, the Victorian country house, the Edwardian country house by style, the classical country house, or by geography. For example, recently was published The Irish Country House. At first, Abigail and I thought we needed a subtitle, something like The Lure of the Land or Heritage and Memory, something to help potential readers along. But as our belief in our subject grew, we realized that the simplicity of Jewish country houses was actually key, so that it sat within the established genre with which it is in conversation. Unapologetic, a little bit provocative, and some people certainly experience it as a challenge. In some ways, our book is in the tradition of Marc Giroir's groundbreaking social history of country houses, which was published in 1978. We use the physical proportions of his life in the French country house that came out in 2000 as the basis for the shape of our book. But its exact form was dictated by the dimensions of Hélène Binet's photographs. This is Nyman's in Sussex. These marvelous photographs challenge many conventions of country house photography. And this slide shows some of the covers of a suitcase full of country house books that we took to Abigail's literary agent when we first pitched the idea. What we wanted our book not to be like. For example, those familiar covers with a splendid edifice across the middle in beige or grey or brick red with a green lawn below and blue sky above. For most readers in Britain and America, the country house is a specifically English idea. It has been claimed that the country house was England's unique contribution to the visual arts. The country house is both an ideal type and a social institution, though in fact rather more various than sometimes thought, from the medieval feudal manor by the Elizabethan powerhouse to the 18th century Palladian house and park at the centre of a working estate, to the Victorian houses of the newly leisured classes that may or may not integrate elements from all of the above. Looking at Jewish country houses challenges not only particular ideas about what constitutes the country house, but also challenges its essential Englishness. The European, even global interconnectedness of the houses we look at in the book is really striking. To make our book distinctively different, even before anyone reads a single word of it, we commissioned Hélène Binet, one of the world's leading photographers, to photograph some of the houses. They are not illustrations to the text, but form a narrative in their own right. This is Nyman's house again in Sussex. Hélène selected the photographs and grouped them, often in surprising and very telling pairs, and her photographs give the book its fundamental visual rhythm. They immerse us in and lead us through spaces. Sometimes they give us pause. They are full of the movement of the seasons. This is the Villa Liebermann in Berlin. They tease out unexpected connections between houses. This is Waddesdon, and on the right, the Villa Liebermann again. They tell us so much about being in the spaces, and they hold many layers of human experience, even though not one of the photographs has people in it. This is the Villa Tugendhat. They are about loss as well as about life. This is Waddesdon Manor in Buckinghamshire, the house I know best, and one of the most visited of all National Trust houses, seen through Hélène's lens. A Victorian hotel of a house that looks from the outside like a French Renaissance chateau. The exterior is pretend, a house in learned, playful masquerade. Inside, it is stuffed full of architectural elements from real French 18th century buildings and thousands of extraordinary works of art, notably the English portraits, French decorative arts, and the kind of medieval and Renaissance treasure cabinet wonders particularly associated with German taste. Waddesdon was built by Baron Ferdinand de Rothschild of the Austrian branch of the banking family, born in Paris, raised in Frankfurt and Vienna, who settled and married in England. He built the house as a stage set for his art collection, a setting for lavish entertaining, and a launch pad for his political career. It is a many-layered Gesamtkunstwerk in which architecture and works of art are carefully integrated, playing with the past and with his complex cultural identity. Ferdinand fashioned himself as a modern collector and pan-European prince. On the right, you see him actually dressed up as a European prince on the way to a fancy dress ball in London at the end of the 19th century. Abigail.
I'm going to set Waddesdon against a house which is much less well known. Eastcliff Lodge, home of Sir Moses Montefiore on the outskirts of Ramsgate. And here you see it depicted by Turner in the 1790s, rather romantically. Superficially, this site seems to tell a very different story. Eastcliff wasn't a bling French-style chateau, but an early example of neo-Gothic English architecture. The house was destroyed, but its early glass houses remain, as does the synagogue, which recalls a Regency townhouse. You can see it here. The Lady Judith Montefiore Theological College, now lost, looked, as you can see, like a lot of other red brick Victorian institutions of higher education. And I love this photograph, not just because you can see the whole complex, but also it's fascinating because it was taken by a Jewish photographer. So there's that dimension to it as well. And if you look, you'll see that really only the mausoleum feels foreign. It's modelled on the tomb of Rachel near Bethlehem. It's a place that feels unapologetically Jewish, in contrast to Waddesdon, which Jewish visitors often read as a site of assimilation. Importantly, it was both publicly and privately Jewish. Images of the Montefiore sukkah were disseminated in the illustrated press, as you can see from this print in a contemporary newspaper. Yet if we think more deeply about these two houses, we can see that they share a common history, because they belong to families that were related, and because they were both, in different ways, Jewish homes. As rich Jews, their owners occupied a particular place in British, European, and Jewish society. The Rothschilds and the Montefiores were lay leaders of the Jewish community. They engaged in international Jewish philanthropy. They moved in aristocratic circles, Sir Moses, Baron Rothschild, and figured in anti-Semitic cartoons like this one, in which the Jews an anti-national element, are conspiring at a key moment in the struggle against Napoleon to drug the king's messengers so they can make a killing to the public's disadvantage. This is how honest folks make money. And both Sir Moses Montefiore, Nathan Rothschild, and Isaac Lyon Goldsmith, in fact, three figures, all of whom owned country houses and were involved in finance in this period, feature in the cartoon. But we might also think of this one, which is the frontispiece of W.T. Stead's Christmas novella, The Splendid Paupers, a book centrally preoccupied with the theme of Jews buying up the great castles and estates of Britain. I hope the point is clear. We aren't attempting to create a typology of Jewish country houses, nor to identify a particular style of country house that was in some sense Jewish. In some way Jewish. Instead, we argue that the Jewishness of these houses is relational. It's about the relationship of their owners to non-Jewish society, which was distinctive. And it's about the relationship of their owners to Jewish society, which was distinctive as well. Let me elaborate. All religious minorities experienced inequality, but the position of Jews as a pan-European non-Christian minority was exceptional in Europe. Perhaps only in the Netherlands was Jewish settlement and land ownership apparently uncontroversial before the French Revolution. Well into the 19th century, Jews elsewhere were precluded from owning real estate except in very rare and anomalous situations. In Italy, most Jews were still confined to urban ghettos, just as they were in Central European cities like Frankfurt and Prague. Elsewhere, from Alsace-Lorraine across to Russia, Jewish residents remained contingent, sometimes permitted, always highly regulated, and often prohibited altogether. We forget that in Britain, too, the right of Jews to own freehold property was uncertain before 1831, and perhaps even until 1846. In retrospect, this seems a minor matter, but to contemporaries it was no such thing, because in 18th and 19th century Britain, citizenship, political rights, and property ownership went hand in hand, and two of the houses in the book tell that story. So if Hughenden, which you see here, is a National Trust property, then that's because Disraeli has been for so long a household name, the father of one nation conservatism and Britain's first and only Jewish Prime Minister. Except he wasn't quite that, because Disraeli's father Isaac, a literary man who rented a gracious Queen Anne house close to Hughenden, fell out with his synagogue, Bevis Marks, over what seems to us at least a trivial financial matter. Benjamin was baptized at the age when he should have become bar mitzvah. Had he remained Jewish, he would never have become an MP, let alone leader of a rump Tory party. For a Tory politician, this background was eccentric. He was permanently broke and likely entered Parliament to avoid a debtor's prison. But as Tory leader, he could not operate without a country house. So the party grandees clubbed together to buy him one, or to help him buy one. Disraeli became the most powerful man in Britain, yet no one, not Victoria, who adored him, nor Bismarck, with whom he famously negotiated at the Congress of Berlin, which you see here, der alte Jude, das ist der Mann, the old Jew, that's the man, as Bismarck said. None of them forgot for a moment that he was a Jew. We find the delicacy of that synthesis preserved at Hughenden, where portraits of Disraeli's Jewish family hang alongside grander paintings of his powerful friends, and in the library, which he inherited from his father. The Salomons estate near Tunbridge Wells, which we can see in this lovely 1868 photograph, is a very different proposition, now a sprawling hotel and events venue in which 2 rooms have been preserved as a family shrine. It feels personal, unlike National Trust properties for the most part, and it feels very much more Jewish, with synagogue vestments preserved behind glass, and even a treasured fragment of the Kotel, better known as the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, or with the Western Wall. This is a house that tells many stories about men who led public lives and the women who loved, lost, and celebrated them. The most prominent is that of Sir David Salomons, the first Jewish Lord Mayor of London and one of the heroes of the long battle for Jewish emancipation. Unlike Disraeli, he didn't convert. When he was elected to Parliament in the early 1850s, he couldn't take his seat as an MP because he refused to swear an oath on the true faith of a Christian. But he did enter Parliament and become the first Jew to speak in it, and you can find the bench from which he was forcibly ejected at Salomon's today. This is not just a British story. We found stories like these all over Europe, and our book tells some of them. Indeed, I would argue that Jewish country houses were as much a hallmark of the age of emancipation as the grand cathedral synagogues. Here you see the Great Synagogue of Rome, inaugurated in 1904, and the Choral Temple in Bucharest, first built in 1857, and these synagogues began to appear across Europe in precisely the same period as these Jewish country houses. Let's think for a moment about Lower Austria. Before the Constitution of 1867, Jews had been barred from living in Lower Austria at all. 10 years later, the Austrian Rothschilds owned 1/3 of the entire Crown land, including massive tracts of forest. Just as the British Rothschilds dominated the Vale of Aylesbury, so the Austrian Rothschilds sprinkled this Rothschild Viertel, as it was called, with their houses. In due course, it became a crucible for both Catholic and socialist anti-Semitism. Or we might think of Walter Rathenau, an industrialist and aesthete who'd been barred from serving as a reserve officer in the Prussian army because he was Jewish. Rathenau was famously ambivalent about his Jewishness. When he eventually became Germany's first and only Jewish foreign minister in the aftermath of World War I, he left the form declaring his religion blank because he asserted it was no longer relevant. Certainly he had known exactly what it meant for a Jew to buy the little Prussian royal palace of Freienwalde and restore it to something like its 18th century perfection. When the court asked him to return the Prussian crown that still sat atop its flagpole, he refused. So perhaps it's not surprising that Freienwalde became a central theme in the anti-Semitic attacks on Rathenau before his 1922 assassination, when the libelous rumours circulated that he had set a sculpture above the gate to his Berlin mansion, featuring the crowned heads of Europe in a sacrificial bowl. This may seem to be a very German story, but it's worth noting that the mausoleum in which Rathenau was buried had been designed by Alfred Messel, whose brother owned Nymans, one of the English properties in our book. Connections like these are not a coincidence, but a feature of the book, just as they were a feature of the milieu it describes. Juliet.
Thank you. Sometimes these pan-European connections are familial. When Ferdinand de Rothschild was preparing to build Waddesdon Manor, and this is a lovely photograph of one of the exterior walls, Ferdinand asked to know the heights above sea level of all the other Rothschild houses in the Vale of Aylesbury, Rothschildshire, as it was sometimes called. Mentmore, designed by Joseph Paxton, famous for having designed the Crystal Palace in London, Mentmore was the most spectacular of the houses with which other members of the Rothschild family competed. Building demonstrates wealth and stability, and this kind of collective, self-reflexive country house construction also asserts unity, essential to the success of a family enterprise, while providing a playful structure for competition and rivalry. And this competitive conversation between different houses in different places moves us into Europe, to Ferrières near Paris, shown here in a print with hunting, shooting going on, and with its aviary. You can see at the bottom the pheasants' cages and an aviary in a lithograph of 1870. Ferrières was built by Ferdinand de Rothschild's great-uncle James, called by anti-Semites Rothschild I, King of the Jews. And like Mentmore, Ferrières was designed by Joseph Paxton. There are very private spaces at Ferrières, a little oratory opposite this smoking room, for example. And the French painter Eugène Lamy, who contributed to the decoration of many of the rooms, conjured up the house as a place of private sociability in a wonderful series of watercolors. But the giganticist spectacle of the palace, full of regal and imperial gestures, was really a very public statement about the status of the Rothschilds. Ferrières had a very different kind of posterity from Waddesdon. During the war, the Rothschilds were stripped of their French nationality. The Nazis recognized Ferrier's emblematic nature, and it was occupied by German troops. The works of art were seized and sent to Bavaria. And it's a sad place to visit now, officially an historic monument owned by the University of Paris, but in fact rather desolate, in what one member of the Rothschild family called a sad, dreamless sleep. Our book follows the story of Jews and their country houses across Europe into waterside villas, agricultural estates, and semi-rural enclaves. In doing so, we travel across the conventional typological and geographical boundaries that have meant that these houses have not been considered together before. There is even an American postscript that considers how Americans adopted some of those European archetypes, each with their particular European histories and connotations, and made those traditions their own. From Rhode Island cottages, this is the beaches in Newport, Rhode Island, where the Jewish American poet Emma Lazarus spent the summers with her family, to Otto Kahn's Oheka Castle on Long Island, here in its 1920s heyday. It provided a model both for the estate of J. Gatsby in Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby and for Orson Welles' vision of Charles Foster Kane's Xanadu in Citizen Kane of 1941. Both great American fables about owning and belonging. It was a particular pleasure to be able to include in our American chapter Falling Water in Pennsylvania, world famous as a seminal Frank Lloyd Wright design, but built for the Pittsburgh department store millionaire Edgar Jonas Kaufman and his wife Liliane, who you see on the terrace at Falling Water here. While American country houses could play a central role in the self-fashioning of wealthy Jews, they were not necessarily the defining attribute of social success that they were in Europe. In Europe, such houses were part of the very fabric of rural society, where they had traditionally fulfilled a very particular set of social, political, and cultural functions rooted in the Ancien Régime. Our book is unusual from an art historical point of view in the way it brings together houses that are divergent in terms of type and style and are not normally thought of together. This, for example, is Villa Kerylos, the library. It must be the most beautiful library in the world, looking out over the Mediterranean, in Beaulieu-sur-Mer on the French Riviera. A turn of the century reimagining of an ancient Greek villa built by the Jewish architect Emmanuel Pomeroli for Theodor Reinach, archaeologist, lawyer, politician, and prominent Dreyfusard. Kerylos is a deeply erudite, private retreat expressive of the humanist and Jewish ideals of its creator, who was the founder of French liberal Judaism. And this is a fountain in one of the courtyards on the way into the house. And on the right, that's the mosaic, a detail of the mosaic floor of that beautiful library you just saw. Villa Montesca in Umbria in Italy is at the center of an agricultural estate and thus is less controversial in terms of traditional definition of what makes a country house a proper country house. It was built by the Italian liberal politician and agricultural reformer Leopoldo Franchetti and his American wife Alice Halgarten, with an extraordinary array of styles, all the cultural high points of the recently united nation of Italy, from the Pietra Serena arcades of the Brunelleschian Renaissance that you see here, to the flamboyantly Baroque illusionistic ceilings in another room. There were botanical gardens, and under the aegis of Alice, the house was the site of educational innovation when Maria Montessori set up a school there, and of the revival and teaching of traditional crafts. I particularly love this photograph of one of the looms. Creativity and making were right at the heart of this house, the Villa Liebermann, which is the studio house and lakeside retreat of the German painter Max Liebermann, completed in 1910 on Lake Wannsee, just outside Berlin. People often ask about the House of the Wannsee Conference, and yes, the Villa Liebermann is 450 meters away along the lakeshore from it. The Wannsee house was originally the Villa Marlier, built in 1914, in fact, by the very same architect as Liebermann commissioned Paul Otto Baumgarten, who became a favorite architect of Hitler. Liebermann died in 1935. In 1940, his widow Martha was forced to sell the house to the German Reich, and in 1943, she killed herself rather than be deported the next day to Theresienstadt. These are some of the beautiful stone surfaces at the Villa Liebermann that have been kind of tooled. I don't know if you can see the surfaces tooled as though they're drawings. They're very beautiful. And then the birch trees on a path that goes from the house to the water of the lake. And Liebermann had originally wanted a path in a very particular place, but he let the birch trees remain where they were so that they kind of move across your path. They remain in your path as you walk down the path. It's very beautiful. The Villa Tugendhat, overlooking Brno in what is now the Czech Republic, is one of the most famous buildings in the world. Mies van der Rohe's modernist masterpiece. And he built it for one of the city's most prominent textile families. And amazingly, Hélène Binet had not photographed it before, and her response proved particularly revelatory. We put quite a lot of these photographs in the book. This is one of the many interiors. The new perspective of our book presents the house in, we hope, a surprising and refreshing way as the culmination of a Habsburg chapter that follows the Royal Kaiser Ferdinand Northern Railway, built to link Vienna with the mines in the north, a great industrial leap forward in which Jewish entrepreneurs had played a major role, and which means the Villa Tugendhat is considered in the context of industry and luxury with other quite different houses, including the Rothschilds' palatial Schillersdorf and the Gutmanns' remodeled Renaissance castle of Tobitschau. Politics comes in here too. An aristocratic style was appropriate for Jews living in the Habsburg Empire, but ceased to be so once they found themselves living in the new Czechoslovak Republic. The Tugendhats' enjoyment of their extraordinary house was brief. They were forced to emigrate when the Nazis closed in on Czechoslovakia, traveling in the opposite direction along the railway that would carry most of Brno's large Jewish population to their deaths. For obvious reasons, few remain of the many, many Jewish country houses that our project identified in Eastern Europe, partly a product of the Holocaust, but also the legacies of war and communism. This is an image of just one of them from a Yizkor book, a type of book that I did not know about before this project, which commemorates Jewish communities lost in the Shoah. Trent Park, near Enfield, as a suburb on the edge of London, links a Jewish country house in Britain with what was happening in Europe in a dark but captivating way. Sir Philip Sassoon, who you see here, very glamorous on the left, painted by Sargent, had turned an old house into the epitome of the English country house. Sassoon used his mastery of architectural style, his collecting, and his ways of living to both enforce and transgress the endlessly seductive idea of the country house. Some of you might have seen the exhibition about the Sassoons that was held a few years ago at the Jewish Museum in New York. During the Second World War, the country house atmosphere of Trent Park was key to a crucial intelligence gathering initiative when Britain's top-ranking Nazi prisoners of war were flattered by the aristocratic ambiance and lulled into a false sense of security in its drawing rooms and parkland. Everything was bugged. The light fittings, the pictures, the trees in the garden, and the prisoners' talk was recorded by secret listeners in the basement, many of whom were German Jews. They gathered thousands of pages of transcripts about military plans and codes and about the murder of Jews in camps and killing sites all over Europe. This is Eric Mark, one of the secret listeners who died only a few years ago. He recalled, "Most of them liked to boast about how many Jews they had killed, which was tough for me to take, being a Jew." Trent Park is currently being turned into flats, but thankfully with a little museum telling its wartime story.
In Britain, of course, country houses remain important symbols of the national past, and the National Trust, which preserves so many, has contributed to that reality. Our book writes their Jewishness into their stories again. Many other houses like Eastcliff and Worth Park, which you see here before and after its destruction, have been lost to posterity. This is quite a complicated story. Please do ask more about it, but I want to hone in on one example which is particularly emblematic. In the early 1970s, the Rothschild Palace of Mentmore, which we saw earlier, was the best preserved Victorian house in the country and boasted a collection that rivaled that of the Queen. But when Mentmore and its contents were offered to the nation at a knockdown price, the nation chose not to save it. 1973 was, of course, a difficult year for many reasons, and the economic and political crisis was likely the most compelling factor. But there is something chilling about the terms in which Duff Cooper, Viscount Norwich, made the case for Mentmore to the House of Lords, and he meant it supportively. It is not in any way characteristic. It is not typical. It represents the international banker's Jewish taste of the Rothschilds. But surely, my lords, it is not the worst for that. What we are discussing is the fact that here we have superb works of art which infinitely transcend the narrow bounds of Englishness or of any other country. Great art belongs to the world. Our book aims to unpick the assumptions that underlie this argument, both the anti-Semitic conception of Jewish taste and a sense that houses like Mentmore were cuckoos in the national nest. But it also reminds us of things it is easy to forget, of the dream of belonging that preceded the Shoah, and of the many ways in which British and European Jewish history converged up to that moment, which marked a seismic break not just in the history of the Jews, but also in the relationship between Britain and the continent. All the houses we focus on in the book are open to the public. Most are easy to visit. Having spent much of the past 10 years talking to the staff and volunteers who work in them, we encourage you to do just that. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for such an incredible discussion, and it was really a treat to see those beautiful photographs. So thank you so much.